And so what I realized was like, I can't make the game have a better frame rate.
No.
You know what I mean?
Not when players are in control of it. Certainly not.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 390 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the webs programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
Hey, this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is November 17th, 2020. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be swears and profanes all over the place on this show. We'd also like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your recurring donations to help us keep our mic juices going. Oh man, we made it straight through that intro.
We did.
Biting the inside of my mouth. That's how we did
When you
it.
said
Sam's
profanes-
blood is pouring out of his mouth.
Yeah, he's just spitting blood. When you said profane, for some reason in my brain, I had the immediately connected to the probably was this.
Yeah, I got to throw you guys.
Propane,
Oh.
which then reminded me of back in our younger days when we played paintball. Seth bought a paintball gun that used propane to power itself.
It was a shotgun, wasn't it?
I still have it. No, it's not a shot. It's a pump. It's what's called the Tippmann C3.
Yep. It's a pump action, so it feels like a shotgun. It's a pump action, propane powered paintball gun. It's not a piece. It's a good thing I have this pop filter on here. Oh boy.
Whew. I loved that paintball gun. I mean, it obviously doesn't compete against the fully automatic 30 shots per second, military grade hardware that people tend to bring to casual matches.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But yeah, it was pump action, so you can only shoot like 1 or 2 shots per second, depending on how fast you can pump it. But it was for starters,
Worked in the cold. That was
it worked in all temperatures because it actually had a combustion chamber in it, and then it had like a little like spark. So it
was a real gun.
Yeah, it had a 9-volt battery, and then it had a thing in there, kind of like a grill igniter, where it would like shoot a little spark in there. So when you pumped it, what the pump did was it would open up a little like plunger where it would pull some propane, like allow some propane into the chamber, and then it would also oxidize, like mix in oxygen with the pump, and then you shoot it. It had a satisfying sound because unlike a normal paintball gun where it just has like air pressure, this one actually had an explosion inside of it. So it was pretty loud.
Yeah.
But it was awesome. And you could get 50,000 shots to a propane tank.
Which is
Very efficient.
I think that's $1 million of paintballs, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
I have a question about categorization, though. Because when you started describing it, all I'm thinking is this is a spud gun, right? Because a spud gun works on the same principle.
Yeah.
A potato cannon, whatever. I think depending on where you are, people have different names for it. But, it's the thing. You just take some PVC pipe, stick a lighter in the back, shoot some hairspray in there, and stick a potato on the top, and boom, you got a cannon, right?
Make sure your mom's not standing behind it in case you didn't secure the lid of it. And
Yep.
It explodes and a piece of it.
It turns out that's the kind of thing that can happen,
We've heard.
We've heard from other people. So this is a gas powered propellant, right? Because when I think of a gun, right, it's got a bullet, and a bullet's got explosive material in it, but it's a solid explosive material, right? So you hit it with a pin, it starts it on fire, and it explodes, and then it creates the gas that shoots out. Yeah. But then you got a spud gun where you shoot an aerosolized or gaseous thing into it. Mm-hmm. And now it's already gas, and you light on a fire, and it's just, now a bigger gas because it just exploded.
Yeah.
So that category of thing where you're using gas first as your propellant, is that only spud guns? Right?
I don't know.
What
it
else
feels
does
almost
that besides this paintball gun and potato
where
cannon?
it's still using an explosion, but it's using gas.
Yeah.
Instead of a solid igniter. I don't know, because even rockets don't do that. Like either they use solid or liquid rocket fuel. They don't just have like a big gas tank, that they use. I don't know. Well, I guess though, because like internal combustion engines use the fumes from gasoline to ignite.
So is a potato cannon just an engine?
I think it's just a car.
It's a one-cylinder. You got a one-cylinder potato cannon.
and
One
it shoots the
potato
cylinder
power.
out of the end. Right. So it's sort of like it's like a uncapped single. Was it, you call it a single stroke engine? No, stroke is something else, right?
Stroke is the
Single piston. Stroke is the
spinny thing, right?
the whirligig, and then the piston is the thing that
Me neither.
does stuff. Yeah, so I think a spud gun is actually just a single piston combustion engine, and then so is this paintball gun.
Yep.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's a great paintball gun. They discontinued it because people wouldn't buy it because they were afraid of it because they're like,
It'll
what if it explodes?
Yeah.
Which it never did. Like that is not something that ever happened.
I mean, those same people probably had a propane tank hooked up to their
or a
outdoor
giant
grill.
compressed air tank, which is what we had, which was more
Yeah.
dangerous.
Or they
than
hop in their
anything.
car and drive around town with a bunch of gasoline in the back. Yeah. I mean, that's just, we're all,
Yeah, with like
you
a
gotta-
4 to 6 cylinder engine right in the front of the car.
Yeah.
That's 4 to 6 times more dangerous than a single piston engine.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, cars are just powered by continuous thousands of explosions, but nobody seems to worry about that, So
Honestly,
you got
the
to
whole
pick your
world.
phobias.
The sun is just a continuous explosion, and then here we are riding around these explosions to get from.
But the sun
just
has
to the
0 pistons, though.
That's true.
In
Which
terms
is
of
weird.
So I
combustion
think-
engines.
So I
Or
think
does
the
it have
moral
infinite
is,
because it's a sphere and there's no cap on any of it?
well, it's going to
Is
run.
that
out
why
of
the
some-
sun is so powerful? Because it's an infinite piston combustion engine?
I think you're right.
That has to be it.
infinite pistons?
Yeah.
Yeah, could be. I don't know, but we might be getting off track because we got to focus here on the Tippmann C3, which ultimately was a great gun, but it did dirty by people's fear of explosions.
Yeah.
All right, now listen, guys.
Yeah.
We got to talk about. So for starters, real quick, Musk Watch, because we gotta close the loop on the saga from last week.
I don't know if there's any closing this loop, to be honest.
Yeah, there's no closing it.
Well, I just want to say a couple things. One is last week we had talked about how the $8 verification thing that literally only lasted for 24 hours, and then they shut it down because it caused so many problems. So that was great. And then since then, we've got updates where Elon has been emailing the employees, basically telling them that they better be hardcore or else, and using those terms exactly, like that they have to become hardcore and work harder and longer hours than ever before. And he even sent out an email saying, click this link if you agree to be hardcore, and if not, then you're gonna get fired. So the saga continues. It's been endlessly entertaining to watch this guy just kind of bumble about and flop around, arguing with his engineers publicly on Twitter about the code that they wrote, and then firing them publicly when they correct him about the code that they wrote. So, it's been great.
It's sort of just a really good case study in how not to manage. So hopefully it's providing a free education for everybody worldwide.
It's how
Just
to
watch
not
this.
do just
Basically anything.
Just anything.
I think
Guys, it's real time.
there's a couple good ways to learn, right? One is you learn by example and you follow in somebody's, footsteps, right? Another is you lead by, or you follow, or you do it by counterexample, where you take some thing and you're like, well, if I just do the opposite of that, that's probably going to be good, right?
Things will work out pretty good.
So I think if you kind of like look at Elon Musk's whole thing, if you just do the opposite of just literally everything that he does, like you're probably going to be just an outstanding person.
You won't be a billionaire though.
No,
That's true.
yeah, you won't be evil enough to become a billionaire, unfortunately.
Yeah. So that's been, just a fun and ongoing thing to watch.
Yeah, not for the employees of Twitter, of course, which has been, I'm sure,
I feel like some of them are kind of
living
having
nightmare.
fun with it though, because apparently tech jobs are still in extremely high demand, and many of them are just hopping straight from Twitter going to other places.
I
And
don't
some
think
of them
that's true for the bulk of the employees, though, because Facebook also laid off 11,000 people.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, Facebook,
And Amazon was on a hiring freeze, and now they're going to be laying off people. Although that might be from Amazon proper.
but there are so many other companies out there looking for good engineers.
I mean, there are. But
Yeah,
there's
the pool
also
is
a big like since everyone got fired at once, there's now a lot of
Yeah,
competition.
30,000 of them entering the market at the same time.
And like, and people have, and it's not that easy, right? Because people have to move and all kinds of things. So it's there's no reason to downplay the trauma.
I think what you're saying
that
is
Elon is causing to everybody.
is that we feel for the people of Twitter, even if the reality show of Elon Musk on Twitter is very good popcorn material. You could do both. It's fine.
Yep.
Yeah, both things can be true.
Both things can be and are true.
All right, now let's talk about some news that just dropped. I think it was yesterday, which is kind of interesting and has something to do with some of our own experiences. Mm-hmm. This is about China and video games in China. So Blizzard, so the creators of StarCraft, Warcraft, Diablo, Overwatch, Hearthstone, Heroes of the Storm, lots of games, lots of franchises. They have been operating in China for about 14 years. And I think they've had all of their properties operating in China. And also worth noting, these are all live service games. So all their games are online. Like they need to be running servers and all this other stuff. So when we brought Crashlands into China, we found that it was bureaucratic, to say the least.
That was in 2007. We started working on it in 2016.
Yeah,
right?
it took like 8 months to get through the process.
Did we get it out in 2016, like end of 2016, or was it the next year? I can't remember.
Was that?
When did we actually? Because it took like 9 months or something from start to finish. But I can't remember if we actually launched in 2017 or 20.
I think it was, yeah.
I think it was November 2017 or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one of the big issues with releasing a game in China, well, there's two primary issues. One is that you yourself cannot do that. You need to have a Chinese company intermediary who basically operates on your behalf. And so they will be your publisher there, and they will manage all the revenues and stuff, and then they'll basically pay you royalties back.
Yeah, which isn't the same as like working with Steam. It's like if you had to have a middleman between you and Steam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's a challenge. And there are only a few companies in China that are authorized by the Chinese government to be these middlemen in the games space. So we worked with Tencent to get Crashlands released in China. Blizzard worked with NetEase to get their properties released. And so they had an ongoing relationship for 14 years to have their games be sellable and operable in China. The second big challenge is the sort of the Great Firewall, as it's often referred to, which is that the Chinese government has a lot of rules and restrictions about ownership of data and flow of data, but just as it relates to moving between China and other countries, right? And so what they will typically demand is that if you're a company like Blizzard, and you want to operate, say, like World of Warcraft, the Chinese players can't play with players from other countries. They have to have their own servers operating in China, and the players play on those servers. Big part of that is because the Chinese government is oftentimes setting lots of laws and regulations about what people can do online. And so they want to make sure that they're controlling both ends of the internet connection, right? Mm-hmm. So like the home or the internet cafe where the game is being played is in China, and the server is in China, and therefore the government can spy on everybody. That's basically both ends. Yeah, that's basically the gist of it. And then the final piece is the cultural stuff, which is the Chinese government is very strict on what people are allowed to say and depict and see and read and whatever, right? It's not a free speech kind of a place. Mm-hmm. And so the censorship is incredible. Just like the amount of censorship is just off the charts. And so the Chinese government will screen everything that gets released to the public, and they will demand changes to it if it doesn't meet whatever it is that their current guidelines are. So in some cases, that means like I know that in World of Warcraft, undead characters had like visible bones sticking out of their bodies, but in China that wasn't allowed because you weren't allowed to depict anything that could indicate something about death, right?
Human remains or something like that, I think. Right?
Yeah, so you can't have like skulls and bones and, any of that stuff. And so they had to make a different character models to cover up those bones and stuff like that. So
These are not
that's
small.
just a small
It's not
example.
small tweaks like, hey, could you guys swear less? It's like blood must now be some other substance entirely. Character models must now be redone. Stories oftentimes have to be sort of sanitized, and not because of the language used, but because of the thematic content present in it, which is much harder to, on a production side, to casually do. Kind of typically requires top to bottom changes across the whole game system. And then now essentially what Blizzard ended up having to do is running two weirdly kind of parallel versions of the title, or creating content that sort of ahead of time tries to keep in mind the various cultural restrictions, and then not develop content that just broadly for the game in the States too, that would end up having to require so much rework downstream. So it's a lot. The censorship sort of gets into the game in the long run. The more people depended on,
which is already this big nest of problems and ethical questions, all this kind of
It's
stuff.
interesting,
right? But it gets topped off though by the fact that it can change on a whim and instantly, right?
Yes, as it has.
As it has, and like that was something that we had to deal with, where all of a sudden we were just told, oh hey, now you have to, because like one of the things that happened to us with Crashlands in China was I think it was in like 2018, I want to say maybe 2019. The government mandated basically like limits on screen time for people under a certain age, right? And so the way that they did that was that they had like every company who was selling games to people had to implement an API that would basically like watch your screen time, and then at a certain point basically like not let you play anymore, or like not, I can't remember what the like outcome was, and like pop up a message and whatever, right? And so like all of a sudden our Tencent people reached out and they're like, oh hey, we need you to like integrate this or update the SDK in Crashlands so that, and hook this thing up so that it like does this. And like
basically, yeah. So your game can check in with the government servers and then lock users out once the government says they can't play anymore. Which is so
wild.
Oh, what a wild thing to have to implement into your game, So it's very costly to bring a game into China and to continue to operate it in that kind of an uncertain, turbulent environment.
But it's also uncertain at the front, like really actually not uncertain. It's almost certain you can't get a game into China anymore because basically you have to actually get like a license to distribute your game, which as Seth said earlier goes through a Chinese company intermediary, right? And so they basically get a license on your behalf for your game on a particular platform or whatever, and that has to go through a government review process. And I think the latest numbers for so back when we launched Crashlands, this wasn't really happening yet. Like everything was still hard, but like it was actually like if you got that intermediary, you had a decent connection, then like
it would take about 6 months.
Get a game
usually.
out. Yeah, it was hard, but most of it was like meeting all the requirements and stuff, right? And then they implemented this like licensing system where they could then just decide how many games the government was going to let through from like outside of China, right? And I believe, unless I'm not horribly mistaken, that last year it was like one game.
Yeah, it was not a lot.
Like literally
they basically just stopped allowing foreign games. Yeah. And so then just yesterday, there was an announcement that Blizzard and NetEase failed to come to an agreement to renew their license to distribute games in China. And so as of January 23, all of Blizzard's games will no longer function in China. So they, they've got hundreds of thousands of WoW subscribers. They've got StarCraft players, Diablo players, like millions of players. But NetEase basically released a statement saying like it's just not worth the cost because NetEase is a middle operator here, so they're just kind of skimming marginally off of what Blizzard is making. And they said that, the full-on revenue from the Blizzard games is only single-digit percentages of NetEase's overall revenue anyways. And the extra burden of trying to deal with all this compliance stuff is just too much, and they would rather not worry about that and instead just focus internally on developing their own IP.
I mean, having been on this side of trying to like, manage that, like we decided we're like, okay, never again unless that situation changes somehow. It's only gotten worse since then, but like that was the idea, right? But yeah, I imagine being, because like every time we've talked to, so like all the events we used to go to in the pre-COVID days, we would meet with people from Tencent and from some smaller publishers and stuff in China, right? To talk about our future games and stuff. And I remember in the earlier day, like in the Crashlands days, for like the couple years around there, it was like really fun and exciting because like there were so many Chinese publishers all of a sudden, and they were like trying to get games in their portfolios, and like there was this vibe that like, oh, this market is like opening up, and
it's growing.
Everybody was excited about it on all sides of, or everywhere across the world, And then once that sort of crackdown started to happen, like, and at first we would still continue talking to these publishers. They still had like this kind of hopefulness where they were like, oh, we're pretty sure we can get these things through. We still have good, connections to government stuff, right? And then over the years, it just like turned into this kind of like depressing.
You could feel their frustration through this.
Yeah, where you'd like interact with it, because we still had publishers reaching out even a year or two ago for like Crashlands in China, like Crashlands Mobile and stuff. And we would get the discussions going, and each time I'd be like, this isn't going to happen because it takes too long. They're not letting the games in. And by the time we actually came to a deal, the likelihood that the government changes something is almost 100%, But they were still hopeful enough that they would like try to make something happen. And inevitably, something would change after the first few months of like slow back and forth, and then they're just gone. They're just evaporated, right? And the whole chat is gone. And it seems to be what happened just across the board, is that this kind of like hopefulness about this this kind of connection between like the Chinese games market and the rest of the world seemed to be this like really great kind of meeting point, and then just evaporated.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as Blizzard is concerned, I think the Chinese market at the peak was something like 12% or 14% of their overall worldwide revenue. So like, I don't know what that represents now. This was maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, back when I saw that figure. So I don't know how big of a hit this is for them, but I think, it sucks for so many of the players who have built up friend groups and stuff and like built hobbies around playing these games consistently. There's very likely like streamers who play these games in China and make a living off of that. So there's an entire ecosystem, like for games that are hobby games like the ones that Blizzard makes and that have been around for that long. There's a lot of people who are gonna have to find something else to do, try to bring their friend groups into other games or whatever. And like something that has always been really interesting is, so as a WoW player, I like to look at, there's a website called Warcraft Logs where you can look at just like reports of people who have done boss fights or whatever. And it's like a full aggregated data dump of everything that they did. Right. And the Chinese players are always doing weird, interesting stuff that nobody else is doing. And I feel like we're going to be losing something like in the WoW community, because what you would always see is like in the European area and like in North America, people would agree on like, oh yeah, this is like the best strategy. This is the best way to beat this boss or whatever. And then some Chinese players would show up and they would do something completely different that made no sense at the time. And they would beat the boss way faster or like way better. And everybody would be looking at it like, what the fuck is this? Right. Yeah. And then if you really dig into it, they would have found some kind of weird trick, that nobody had really thought of. And it's because like, culturally, people have different ways of thinking about things, right? And like different lenses through which to view stuff. And I think, just you could see that play out in how people played the game. And it sucks because we're like, that's going away.
Yeah. Right. You're losing a cultural player base as opposed to just like
It's always the problem of isolation and homogeny, right? Is that
you don't bring in any new interesting perspectives, Yeah. So that's going to be an interesting, thing to kind of watch unfold. It's not clear whether or not Blizzard is going to pursue a new publishing partner, and if they did, would they be the the one game, the one company that gets a new license in 2023, or will just no new companies get allowed in? I don't know. But yeah, all this stuff has definitely sort of pushed us out of the idea of like probably not going to be pursuing anything in China in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much work.
A lot, and I don't see that happening anytime.
Yeah, and we've kind of gotten past the idea of changing our games to meet some kind of a censorship requirement when the intent of the censorship is to, try to ensure that the public doesn't have any anti-authority or, tendencies or like that's messed up.
That feels gross. Yeah.
And we don't want to be involved in that anymore. Yeah. So, all right, you guys want to get to some questions?
Yeah.
All right. These questions come from podcast.bscotch.net. Highest upvoted question comes from Fraser, who says, Crashlands 2 sounds really ambitious. Have you run into any performance limitations working in GameMaker that you can't optimize your way out of? Anything that's impacted the design?
Well, I think let's talk about the ambitious note first, because like we should discuss this. We had a pizza party last Friday,
Yeah. You got
Management was very enjoying everybody's work, so everybody got a pizza. That's sort of, it was a joke that we turned into a real thing, basically, at the studio. Every quarter or so, we have a pizza party. Everybody plays video games for the afternoon, just kind of hangs out. So one of the things we talked about was how in the last 6 months or so, with the Game Changer, with Jen on the narrative side, the game's overall kind of core content development has started just kind of very rapidly exploding in terms of how quickly we're putting all this stuff together. And on the ambition front, when we had set out to make the game back in, 2021, January, kind of officially, with the overall scope of what we wanted to do, the amount of kind of systemic interactivity between the different things that are in the world and the player and the stories you wanted to tell, all that stuff, we knew that we literally could not build it, which is weird because that was the way it was sort of with the first one too, right? It was very much
and with Levelhead.
There's always some piece of it, I feel like, that we're like, we don't know how to do that exactly. But I think with Crashlands 2, it was very much a from the bottom up thing where we were changing how the art was done. We knew we were going to have to change how content was developed, kind of everything. So the level of ambition of the project then was so high that the freaky thing, the first year and some change working on it, about a year and a half almost, was that we couldn't quite tell actually if we were going to be able to do it, right? You're developing all these tools and pipelines and stuff and slowly developing content, slowly developing parts of the game. But the whole time kind of with a lack of clarity as far as like, okay, is this actually enough to be able to do what we're really setting out to do here? And I think it's only in the last couple of months that's like really kicked off, probably since midsummer or so. And so with that, there's been tons of kind of optimization related things or even just production related things that have been, intensely challenging about getting the thing to work. And then on the GameMaker side, we've had to, we've developed stuff built like a UI engine thing called Cake Frames, which then, allowed us to and made it possible for us to build UIs very, very quickly and much more easily, which of course means that there's more of them, which meant that suddenly that, again, optimization problems start showing up. As soon as you make something easy, then you run into this Jevons paradox problem, as we talk about in the podcast somewhat frequently, which is that as soon as it's easy to do something, you get a lot of it, right? And the whole point of Crashlands development has been we need to make everything easy to do because we need a lot of just about everything, and we need these bottlenecks relieved. And so I think most of our optimization woes have come down to new places where that volume of stuff is showing up, or where these completely new things that we're doing with shaders, with just how many things are on screen at a time, all sorts of things like that, have been new enough that we don't have tools or kind of optimization pathways just kind of out of the gate on already.
Yeah, so, and this is the Jevons paradox is real. I mean, it's always there, and this is that idea that, just to remind if our listeners don't know the Jevons paradox, it's the idea that you can never reduce the usage of a system by making it more efficient. You will only increase the usage. So it's the idea of saying, oh, wow, there's a lot of traffic congestion downtown. Let's add 3 lanes. and then you add 3 lanes, and then within a month, your commute takes just as long as it did before. Because when there's more lanes, either more people start driving or more people take that route, to the point where like once that route goes back to being as slow as it was before, then maybe they'll start considering alternative routes, right? But
but the nuance, of course, is that because, like Sam said earlier, if you make something more efficient, you get more of that thing, and that's not a paradox. That's just an obvious fact, right? So, the Jevons paradox comes from the failure to optimize for the right thing, right? As in, like, when you make it more efficient, in the case of like the classic Jevons paradox example, when you're making it more efficient to move traffic, right, with the goal of speeding traffic up, right, then that doesn't happen. But if the goal is to make it so that more people can get where they're trying to go on the same time scale, you do get that actually, right? So it's kind of that's a cautionary tale of making sure you understand what you're optimizing for.
Yeah. More people can get there in the same amount of time, but each person will not have a faster commute.
Yes.
Right. So it's like if you want...
The congestion is just as bad as it was. So you couldn't solve the congestion problem by adding more, right?
Yeah. And you might have added a parking problem.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Probably.
Yeah. So it's like if you want to make it so that commutes are faster, then maybe go for buses, right? Because then you're optimizing for getting each person there as quickly as possible
And reducing the number of cars involved.
Yeah, which is reducing the number of cars. Then you don't have to do a big like construction project and all of that stuff. So when it comes to this this idea of optimization, this is something we found in Levelhead as well, where there was a time early in Levelhead's development where I was pretty obsessive about optimization because people kept making levels that would run at like 5 frames per second. And we added in some extra things where like if on their machine the frame rate of the level dropped too low, then they wouldn't be allowed to publish it, And people would write in feedback tickets saying like, oh yeah, I put a whole bunch of this one kind of an item into my level and the frame rate was really bad. Can you optimize like that item, right? And I'd be like, sure. And so if I got that item to be twice as performant, then they would just add twice as many of it.
Yep.
Right up until the point where the frame rate got just to that lowest level. And so what I realized was like, I can't make the game have a better frame rate.
No,
you know what I mean?
Not when players are in control of it. Certainly not.
All I can do is make it so that people can put more stuff in their levels, but the frame rate is just going to be as low as possible. That's what it's going to be, right? And so when it comes to Crashlands 2 stuff, we got to kind of think in the same terms, which is like if the game is running at 60 FPS on mobile, basically like to me, like that's kind of like my target is if it's hovering around 60 FPS on a device that's a few years old, then like newer devices, it'll run better. Older devices, it may get down to like 40 FPS or even 30, but that's still okay on mobile. And if it starts to drop below that, then that starts to be a bad gameplay experience. And so all we got to do is every now and then we just do some profiling and we just see like, okay, based on what it is that we've put into the game at this point, are there certain things that are consuming a lot more system resources than we would like? Or, are they sort of disproportionately consuming more than their share? And if so, then we can look at those to optimize them. But with the understanding that, if we optimize them let's say we optimize them to the point where now we're running at 120 frames per second, right? So we just double the performance of the game. The game's running great. Within a month, it'll be back down to 60 because we'll just pack more stuff into the game. That's just the nature of the Jevons paradox, right?
Yeah. Well, but I think it's actually the core point about optimization is optimization isn't the point. Right.
Correct.
Because that's the only reason you run into a Jevons paradox is because you're focused on the wrong goal, right? Because that you're optimizing something for the purpose of something else, right? So if you like go back to this example of these Levelhead players just like fucking filling a level with stuff, right?
I think it was Springs. That was one of the first.
Springs really fucked with things, yeah. So if that's the kind of like player experience you want to enable, right? Then you need to optimize that so that it can happen. If it's not, if you don't care about that or don't want that to be something that players do, then you don't need to optimize that, right?
In fact,
and I think it's the
should
same,
not.
and you shouldn't actually, because you need it to not happen, right? You need to find ways to prevent it. And I think with like regressions, it's the same. Regressions 2, it's the same deal, right? Which is, yeah, you can always optimize stuff to improve it, but we have, and since we're not doing, level head where players make their own stuff, we have the most powerful lever of all that we get to pull, which is the design lever, right? Because in level head, players got to design stuff, so they just get to just fuck with things as much as they want, right? And they get to work outside of the constraints and the limitations of what we're providing. But in Crashlands 2, if we design something and we can't get it to perform, or it just doesn't perform well, if it knocks the frame rate down, right? Then we have two solutions. One is we try to find a way to optimize it so that we can have that exactly as is. Or we can say, does it have to be this way, right? Can we do something else, right? So do we need to be able to have 20 creatures on screen fighting each other at the same time, right? Because if we do, then yeah, we have to figure out how to optimize that to make that work. But if we cannot have to do that, then now that's an optimization we don't have to figure out and do. So, and just, I mean, all of game design, actually just all of technical anything, it's the same deal with like building a website or anything, right? Where, as an example, I'm working on a piece of web tech and I have a list of 900 things, right, to show the user, right? And it just, whatever, it's the web. Like that shit's optimized really well over 40 fucking years, right? So like, it just spits it out. It's fine, right? But I was like, oh, because part of what has to happen is there's a transition where you like check things, right? And then the things that you check need to get kind of sort themselves to the top. So I want that to be animated, so you can see it happen, so it's not confusing. But if I animate it, then every time you check a box, it takes like a second to resort, because the calculation across 900 items to figure out where everything has to go and then animate it smoothly, right, is so fucking expensive, right? So two solutions there. One is figure out how to make that animation just really fucking optimized, right? Or say, okay, I won't animate this then, right? So go for the latter. That was the better move in that scenario, right? And all of these are basically making those choices. And there are other things I could have done too, of like, can I find a way to only display 9 at a time? Or whatever, instead of 900, right? And
Paging, right?
Yeah, do like paging or do something else, right? Or do like some kind of lazy loading where if it's off screen, it evaporates and I just like pad it with space or something, right? And so everything that we're doing all the time is trying to find ways to make the design we want happen. But given the reality and the constraints of the systems we're working in and our knowledge and skills, right? But our time constraints also, right? Then we always have to ask this question of what experience are we trying to enable? And how do we get that or close to that in a time efficient way on the development side, right?
Yeah, I think there's very few
development
games.
Actually, optimization is the place where we actually are spending all of our time, not optimization of the product, right?
Yeah, I think there's very few games that are optimization focused in a way that you can tell. And what I mean by that is where the point is, from a player standpoint, the point is experiencing a whole lot of something, right? I think 2 games recently that fall in this category, and this is where I think being extremely good at engineering on the optimization side can be a thing that you use as a design point for a game, right?
Yeah, because otherwise you literally couldn't do it, right? Like
you can't do certain things. So like They Are Billions is a very good example of this. I don't know how they draw so many fucking zombies on screen at a time, for example, in that game.
RimWorld.
RimWorld manages this actually pretty well. And then more recently, I played Vampire Survivors, which is basically just a bullet hell sort of thing. But the sheer amount of things on the screen, like, never mind the fact that each one is like a little dumb pixelated monster that's hardly moving and just kind of looping a silly animation and doesn't really have a lot going on. But it's like the computational expense of drawing that many things is just in handling interactions and collisions.
Or like a game that has foliage, right?
Yeah.
Both to, and if it's foliage that like reacts to stuff in the environment, especially, but even just foliage that like has proper shadows. Because it's like if you're like playing most games that have foliage, you just walk right through it. It's not actually there, right?
Oh yeah.
And it's extremely rare to have something where you actually like can see it move because something happens. Can't even think of an example. But even like having good shadows, extremely rare, right? Because if you want foliage, then now you have an engineering optimization problem, right? And you have to decide, okay, well, does that mean it's not interactive, right? Does that mean we have bad shadows? Does that mean the whole space is dark so we don't have to deal with shadows? You know,
does that mean our production is devoting 10% of its budget to foliage tech? You know,
yeah. Or if in the case of like We Are Billions,
Mm-hmm.
like literally like the whole point of the game was like
zombie horde,
right? And so
Billions of zombies.
So yeah, so definitely like they spent 80% probably of all of their design and engineering time trying to figure out how to make that possible from all sides of the problem, right? Like how does it get drawn? Because that means they're using they'll have to be using weird as fuck techniques to do this, right?
Oh
like,
yeah. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, because games are already smoke and mirrors, you know, where like this thing that you're looking at isn't really there, you know, and it's all just like tricks to hide stuff and to try to draw your eye to. It's like doing magic tricks constantly, and in those kinds of contexts, they'll be doing weird stuff like having a shader, which is basically a way that you like after the computer does stuff, you just kind of post process what's on the screen and convert it to something else, right? Where you can basically make a shader that just like, if you're really fucking clever, that just turns one zombie into 10, you know, or whatever, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that people have to do to make these things happen. But if you want that to be your thing, like that's what you're choosing. So if you choose like, I want to have 1,000 things on screen at once, you have opted into a complicated engineering problem. Like that's what you're solving. If like in our case, we're talking about Crashlands 2, and we're trying to have certain kinds of experiences that are mostly about you interacting with a world that feels alive and feels like it's responding to you, right? The operative concept there is feels like, you know, like it doesn't have to actually be responsive to what you're doing. It has to feel like it is, right? And so
there's cheap ways to get that.
There's cheap ways to do that. Yeah, because you can have a creature that just has kind of some random behaviors, but if they're designed and tweaked in the right way, it can feel like it's responding to things, even if it's not. Because human brains will force patterns onto things. That's what they're good at. They'll pull patterns out of noise that aren't even there. And
we've seen this already with these early playtests and stuff, where the big thing that we managed to hit, which I'm just so excited about, is the sense of the world having that ecology feel to it, where creatures, which are currently, as far as how their behavior is determined and stuff, they do use a couple of little inputs to figure out kind of what to do, but it's very random.
Because AI is so fucking expensive, right?
Yeah, so most of it's just random stuff, but players will naturally build up mental models and stories about what's happening with the different creatures by watching these essentially random behaviors play out, right? And so you end up getting the sense that that creature is sort of stalking you or keeping an eye on you or whatever, or that one is happy after it, you know, ate a tree or something like that. When in reality, it's just happened to be two random events put next to each other, and then you spin a story out, right?
Mm-hmm. And then you start to reinforce that pattern every time you see it in your own brain, right? I think another example of like using the reality of human psychology to optimize, right? Instead of the engineering side. So in Levelhead, we wanted to let you basically play random levels out of the pool of player-made levels, right? The problem is, for anybody who's ever worked with a database, that the concept of random doesn't exist, right? It's not a real thing. And if you want to efficiently randomly pull stuff out of a database, it's not possible, right? It's just that you can only ever pretend in some way, and the more random it is, the higher cost the thing that you have to do to pretend that it is going to be. And what we ended up doing is we just sorted levels by their random identifier, right? Which is just like some alphabetic characters, right? Which basically puts them into a random order, but it's the same order every time, right? And so then we just like do a few requests, like to go grab some levels, right? Where we just choose a different point in that sorted list, right? So that there's no relationship between how they are relative to each other, but we just pull some random things out, and we'll tweak some of the parameters that we use to like filter, so that we just get a slightly different set, you know. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes we'll reverse it, you know, just to. Mm-hmm. And so like we'll grab things from a few different points and like reverse a couple of them, and then like interleave them with each other or whatever. And then we just lean on the fact that there are way more levels that a single player can play, mm-hmm. right? So that if you just start at random points in the list and grab a handful of levels. Yeah. You're probably not going to play the same level twice. And if you do, it won't be that often, you know? And so it's like a shuffle feature on a song playing app, you know, like iTunes or Spotify or whatever. It's pseudo random, right? And they don't actually care if you hear the same song. Like what they actually do is they try to make it so that you don't hear the same song within like, 5
Well,
songs
yeah,
or
because
whatever.
you as a person are not coming to the music service or to Levelhead or whatever else saying, I need true randomness.
Yeah.
Like what I'm
Like
seeking
you think
is,
that's what you want. Yeah.
is deeply felt chaos. That's what I want. And it's like,
But what
no,
you
no,
actually
just
want is just
a
to feel like
variety.
you want a variety. You want to feel like you're not seeing the same thing twice. That's what you're
Yeah,
actually.
I was saying, people do say that. People do say, I want true randomness. And to them, true randomness means I never experience the same thing twice in a row, which is not random. That's a pattern, right? Like that's coming in and saying, I want a reinforced pattern. Or even not even twice in a row. Just, I never want to experience the same thing again, you know? Because if it was totally random, then it would be possible for you to get the same level like 4 times in a row.
That's true.
Depending on the number of levels. But
Statistically improbable, but still possible.
but technically possible.
Yeah. And so that's a lot of what we do in the games then as far as the optimization goes is instead of spending a bunch of time, say like in Crash Bandicoot 2, like Sam said, developing a ton of AI to try to make like actual behaviors in the world that have like a lot of intent behind them, you create a sort of a constellation of random behaviors that a thing has. And as those random behaviors occur in certain orders or in certain patterns, then you have your God of the gaps. Like the player's mind just fills in the intent behind it. And so, you can kind of do that with all kinds of things. Yeah. And that's even stuff like when we have creatures that are responding to things in the world, they aren't scanning the world every frame and evaluating what's around them every frame to decide what to do next.
Which would be the most reactive, right? Technically.
Yeah, that'd be the most reactive. But actually that's not even believable. Like nothing reacts instantly to stuff that's happening around it. There's a moment of like, what's happening? Like there's a moment of thought or processing. And so just put it on like a half second or a 1 second interval, where it's like, oh, maybe like once per second, the creatures will kind of check what's around them and be like, is this something I should try to eat? Is this scary? Should I try to run away? And then by even like randomizing that interval a bit. So sometimes they'll check in like a half second. Sometimes they'll check in a second and a half, and depending on all that stuff, then you kind of get this sort of organic feeling to things where, maybe sometimes you'll be able to like quickly run past a creature and you happen to squeeze through that interval, right? And you just think to yourself like, oh man, this one didn't notice me. Right. Which is technically true. Like it didn't notice you, but it's not that you did a better job sneaking or that creature's particularly dumb, but those are the things that your brain will kind of fill in. Yeah. It's just that you just threaded an invisible timer on accident, right? And so those are the kinds of things where we can optimize for performance, but then also use those optimizations to sort of bring in new gameplay experiences that are closer to what we want anyways.
Yeah, and that's always the goal is to marry those two things together really well so that the design fully takes into account both the human psychology of the experience that we're trying to create and like what it means for a person to experience that, and the technical limitations of the system in which we're operating, right? Is how do we come up with designs that actually just embrace all of those things and pull it all together into one solution that isn't like, oh no, like we can only have this bad AI that like we hate and we feel like it sucks because we couldn't find a way to optimize it.
Yeah.
Whereas instead it's like, oh, isn't it cool that we can basically give things like slow polling coupled with random behaviors that are sort of biased towards things, right? But not just like dictated by, right? And then end up with stuff that's just unpredictable enough that players fill in their own stories for how things work. Because I mean, even like think about like if you have a pet,
Yep.
Like that pet's behavior pretty well. Like what it's into, right? But at any given moment, if you look at it and it does something, why the fuck did it do that? You have no idea, like absolutely no idea. You're like your cat just suddenly sprints off and like jumps up on something and starts punching it, right? Just all of a sudden out of nowhere, right? Mm-hmm. Dog suddenly wakes up and like does something, right? Or just like, or my cat will just sometimes just like get up on something high and just stare into my eyeballs, right? Like, why? Why is it doing that?
Yeah, and the thing is, that's a thing that the cat does sometimes. Like that's a behavior that you have in your brain of like, I know that's one of its random roles of states to enter, right? Random staring state. But you don't know what leads it to do that at any given point in time.
Yeah. Well, that's where the mixing it with context is where all the storytelling happens, right? It's like you can take the same behavior and you just randomly splatter it into a bunch of different contexts. And it's like, yeah, your cat just staring at you, while you're sitting down doing some writing feels a certain way. Your cat staring at you while you're cooking something feels a completely different way. Your cat coming and staring at you while you're on the toilet feels a completely different way, right? And it's like every single one of those could actually have the exact same cat behavior, which is the cat's just like, I'm going to look at this person. That might be it. But there's no contextual clues, maybe. Who knows? But in your mind, you might be like, oh, they want some food now because they're looking at me while I'm making food. And so that marriage of randomness and context is what creates these emergent stories.
Yeah. And they may or may not be true, right?
Yep. But it doesn't matter.
And it's the same thing too, where it's like if you're watching a squirrel outside running around, like it'll just suddenly stop and like stand there for a second. The fuck is it doing?
Right? Like, oh, it sensed me. No, probably not.
It's like, it must be like hearing it, which might be true. Who knows? Right. And then it kind of runs off in seemingly random direction, starts digging, as far as you can tell from the outside, like it's just doing weird random stuff. But you start to put a story together where it's like listening for predators, that it like runs off and it's like looking for a hole to put a nut later or find one that it had previously, right? And maybe every once in a while you see it pull a nut out of the ground, right? So so there are like things happen that reinforce these models on top of what otherwise, as far as all the evidence you have like in the moment, is just random behavior. Like there's no way to explain any given thing. It's just every once in a while, something that happens is coupled with some other thing to which you could apply a story that feels like it makes sense, right? And now that just becomes
it's not random, but it's biased.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And what exactly is going to happen next is sort of like random among a selection of biased actions.
Yeah,
right?
based on the context, right? So
based on the context.
Yeah, it's like, if a cat appears, you're like, okay, well, it's really likely that if that squirrel notices, like, well, it notices, who does? But if it notices, probably it's going to go run up a tree, right?
But it might not, though.
But it might not. It might run somewhere else. It might just stand there. And the cat and the squirrel might play with each other.
Yeah. Shit.
Or the squirrel might attack the cat, Like,
it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's just, the world is chaos. Context. Yeah. And you need it's the interactivity plus the randomness, plus things that at least they're never so far outside of like, normal, right?
No, the squirrel doesn't with that
doesn't
pocketbook
make
and
sense.
start taking anthropological notes on you or something.
It doesn't shoot the cat, like that doesn't happen, right? But almost anything else does within like the realm of what a squirrel could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then when it comes to sort of like the ambitious scope of Crashlands 2, our goal with any given thing in the game is to kind of optimize toward that vibe where it's like stuff in the world feels like it has intent and feels like it has these kind of reactive behaviors based on what's going on around it, because they do. But at the same time, the number of behaviors that things have is actually not that large. It's just that they're reactive enough to what's going on around them, and they're still random enough that your brain can kind of fill in the gaps. And so we can make a game that feels like it has a huge, expansive interactive ecosystem that is far deeper than the code. Sort of like it's far deeper than the code says it is. But then there's that kind of interesting side note, which is like when you're walking around the world, if you see all these different things interacting in all these different ways, in ways that feel like they have intentionality, in the same way as like when you're walking through the woods and you see a critter in the real life doing something, right? Then it doesn't really matter that the code didn't exactly specify this situation, right? Because you still got the situation. Mm-hmm. It's still happening, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we're using to kind of bridge the gap of making sure that the game is as big as we want it to be, is like all these little kinds of tricks.
Yeah. But I think part of it too is that this is also the way that makes sense for things to work, right? Because that is what your actual experience out in the world is. You don't think of it that way because you think of it all because like you're immersed in it. You think of it as making sense. But if you actually sit down and just like observe, right? And just observe stuff, it is basically random. Like you're just retconning constantly everything that happens around you, right? To apply like a reason and a pattern and so on, right?
This happened because of this, and then that happened because of that. And if that were, it kind of reminds me of our chaos conversation from a long time ago, right? But like if that were actually true, that like everything just had a specific one-to-one causality to it,
Yeah, so
then
boring, right?
you would always be able to predict what was going to happen next, right? But you can't. You can guess based on the context, but there's no definite answer to what you're going to do next today, what your dog is going to do next, what your kid is going to do next. Everybody's just acting on these kind of like biases based on context, and so so you can make some really dynamic, interesting, programmed ecosystems that actually have very little code going on, but that still create that kind of a feeling. So
yeah, well, I would actually also argue that you can't create that feeling with highly deterministic code.
that's true.
Because
Now things are too specific.
yeah, because
too predictable.
Because to capture something that then looks random but is actually just like fully deterministic, right, is extremely difficult to do, and so it's just easier to let it be actually random to match, the reality of what it looks like it is.
Yeah. So always lean on randomness first, and only go into specifics of coding things up if randomness doesn't get you there, which it will most of the time.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.